Three Stories from Kiss Kiss by Roald Dahl. Read by Edward Petherbridge. Royal Jelly.
"It worries me to death, Albert, it really does," Mrs. Taylor said. She kept her eyes fixed on the baby, who was now lying absolutely motionless in the crook of her arm. "I just know there's something wrong." The skin on the baby's face had a pearly, translucent quality, and was stretched very tightly over the bones. "Try again," Albert Taylor said. "It won't do any good." "You have to keep trying, Mabel," he said. She lifted the bottle out of the saucepan of hot water and shook a few drops of milk onto the inside of her wrist, testing for temperature. "Come on," she whispered. "Come on, my baby, wake up and take a bit more of this." There was a small lamp on the table close by that made a soft yellow glow all round her. "Please," she said, "just take a weeny bit more." The husband watched her over the top of his magazine. She was half dead with exhaustion, he could see that, and the pale oval face, usually so grave and serene, had taken on a kind of pinched and desperate look. But even so, the drop of her head as she gazed down at the child was curiously beautiful. "You see," she murmured, "it's no good. She won't have it." She held the bottle up to the light, squinting at the calibrations. "1 ounce again. That's all she's taken. No, it isn't even that. It's 3/4. It's not enough to keep body and soul together, Albert. It really isn't. It worries me to death." "I know," he said. "If only they could find out what was wrong." "There's nothing wrong, Mabel. It's just a matter of time." "Of course there's something wrong. Dr. Robinson says no." "Look," she said, standing up, "you can't tell me it's natural for a 6-week-old child to weigh less by more than 2 whole pounds than she did when she was born. Just look at those legs. They're nothing but skin and bone." The tiny baby lay limply on her arm, not moving. "Dr. Robinson said you was to stop worrying, Mabel. So did that other one." "Oh," she said, "isn't that wonderful? I'm to stop worrying." "Now, Mabel." "What does he want me to do? Treat it as some sort of joke?" "He didn't say that." "I hate doctors. I hate them all," she cried, and she swung away from him and walked quickly out of the room towards the stairs, carrying the baby with her. Albert Taylor stayed where he was and let her go. In a little while he heard her moving about in the bedroom directly over his head, quick, nervous footsteps going tap, tap, tap on the linoleum above. Soon the footsteps would stop, and then he would have to get up and follow her, and when he went into the bedroom he would find her sitting beside the cot as usual, staring at the child and crying softly to herself and refusing to move. "She's starving, Albert," she would say. "Of course she's not starving." "She is starving. I know she is. And Albert—" "Yes?" "I believe you know it too, but you won't admit it. Isn't that right?" Every night was like this. Last week they had taken the child back to the hospital, and the doctor had examined it carefully and told them that there was nothing the matter. "It took us nearly 9 years to get this baby, Doctor," Mabel had said. "I think it would kill me if anything should happen to her." That was 6 days ago, and since then it had lost another 5 ounces. But worrying about it wasn't going to help anybody, Albert Taylor told himself. One simply had to trust the doctor on a thing like this. He picked up the magazine that was still lying on his lap and glanced idly down the list of contents to see what it had to offer this week. Among the Bees in May, Honey Cookery, The Bee Farmer and the Bee Farm, Experiences in the Control of Nosema, the latest on Royal Jelly, this week in the Apiary, The Healing Power of Propolis, Regurgitations, British Beekeepers' Annual Dinner, Association News. All his life Albert Taylor had been fascinated by anything that had to do with bees. As a small boy he used often to catch them in his bare hands and go running with them into the house to show his mother, and sometimes he would put them on his face and let them crawl about over his cheeks and neck, and the astonishing thing about it all was that he never got stung. On the contrary, the bees seemed to enjoy being with him. They never tried to fly away, and to get rid of them he would have to brush them off gently with his fingers. Even then they would frequently return and settle again on his arm or hand or knee, any place where the skin was bare. His father, who was a bricklayer, said there must be some witch's stench about the boy, something noxious that came oozing out through the pores of the skin, and that no good would ever come of it, hypnotizing insects like that. But the mother said it was a gift given him by God, and even went so far as to compare him with St. Francis and the birds. As he grew older, Albert Taylor's fascination with bees developed into an obsession, and by the time he was 12, he had built his first hive. The following summer, he had captured his first swarm. 2 years later, at the age of 14, he had no less than 5 hives standing neatly in a row against the fence in his father's small backyard, and already, apart from the normal task of producing honey, he was practicing the delicate and complicated business of rearing his own queens, grafting larvae into artificial cell cups, and all the rest of it. He never had to use smoke when there was work to do inside a hive, and he never wore gloves on his hands or a net over his head. Clearly there was some strange sympathy between this boy and the bees, and down in the village, in the shops and pubs, they began to speak about him with a certain kind of respect, and people started coming up to the house to buy his honey. When he was 18, he had rented 1 acre of rough pasture alongside a cherry orchard down the valley about a mile from the village, and there he had set out to establish his own business. Now, 11 years later, he was still in the same spot, but he had 6 acres of ground instead of 1, 240 well-stocked hives, and a small house that he'd built mainly with his own hands. He had married at the age of 20, and that, apart from the fact that it had taken them over 9 years to get a child, had also been a success. In fact, everything had gone pretty well for Albert, until this strange little baby girl came along and started frightening them out of their wits by refusing to eat properly and losing weight every day. He looked up from the magazine and began thinking about his daughter. That evening, for instance, when she had opened her eyes at the beginning of the feed, he had gazed into them and seen something that frightened him to death, a kind of misty, vacant stare, as though the eyes themselves were not connected to the brain at all, but were just lying loose in their sockets like a couple of small grey marbles. Did those doctors really know what they were talking about? He reached for an ashtray and started slowly picking the ashes out from the bowl of his pipe with a matchstick. One could always take her along to another hospital, perhaps. He might suggest that to Mabel when he went upstairs. He could still hear her moving around in the bedroom, but she must have taken her shoes off now and put on slippers because the noise was very faint. He switched his attention back to the magazine and went on with his reading. He finished the article called Experiences in the Control of Nosema, then turned over the page and began reading the next one, the latest on royal jelly. He doubted very much whether there would be anything in it that he didn't know already. What is this wonderful substance called royal jelly? He reached for the tin of tobacco on the table beside him and began filling his pipe, still reading. Royal jelly is a glandular secretion produced by the nurse bees to feed the larvae immediately they have hatched from the egg. The pharyngeal glands of bees produce this substance in much the same way as the mammary glands of vertebrates produce milk. The fact is of great biological interest because no other insects in the world are known to have evolved such a process. All old stuff, he told himself, but for want of anything better to do, he continued to read. Royal jelly is fed in concentrated form to all bee larvae for the first 3 days after hatching from the egg. But beyond that point, for all those who are destined to become drones or workers, this precious food is greatly diluted with honey and pollen. On the other hand, the larvae, which are destined to become queens, are fed throughout the whole of their larval period on a concentrated diet of pure royal jelly, hence the name. Above him, up in the bedroom, the noise of the footsteps had stopped altogether. The house was quiet. He struck a match and put it to his pipe. Royal jelly must be a substance of tremendous nourishing power, for on this diet alone the honey-bee larva increases in weight 1,500 times in 5 days. That was probably about right, he thought, although for some reason it had never occurred to him to consider larval growth in terms of weight before. This is as if a 7.5-pound baby should increase in that time to 5 tons. Albert Taylor stopped and read that sentence again. He read it a 3rd time. This is as if a 7.5-pound baby. "Mabel," he cried, jumping up from his chair. "Mabel, come here." He went out into the hall and stood at the foot of the stairs, calling for her to come down. There was no answer. He ran up the stairs and switched on the light on the landing. The bedroom door was closed. He crossed the landing and opened it and stood in the doorway looking into the dark room. "Mabel," he said, "come downstairs a minute, will you, please? I've just had a bit of an idea. It's about the baby." The light from the landing behind him cast a faint glow over the bed, and he could see her dimly now, lying on her stomach with her face bedded in the pillow and her arms up over her head. She was crying again. "Mabel," he said, going over to her, touching her shoulder, "please come down a minute. This may be important." "Go away," she said. "Leave me alone." "Don't you want to hear about my idea?" "Oh, Albert, I'm tired," she sobbed. "I'm so tired. I don't know what I'm doing any more. I don't think I can go on. I don't think I can stand it." There was a pause. Albert Taylor turned away from her and walked slowly over to the cradle where the baby was lying and peered in. It was too dark for him to see the child's face, but when he bent down close he could hear the sound of breathing, very faint and quick. "What time is the next feed?" he asked. 2 o'clock, I suppose." "And the one after that?" 6 in the morning. "I'll do them both," he said. "You go to sleep." She didn't answer. "You get properly into bed, Mabel, and go straight to sleep, you understand? And stop worrying. I'm taking over completely for the next 12 hours. You'll give yourself a nervous breakdown going on like this." "Yes," she said. "I know." "I'm taking the nipper and myself and the alarm clock into the spare room this very moment. So just you lie down and relax and forget all about us, right?" Already he was pushing the cradle out through the door. "Oh, Albert," she sobbed. "Don't you worry about a thing. Leave it to me." "Albert." "Yes?" "I love you, Albert." "I love you too, Mabel. Now, go to sleep." Albert Taylor didn't see his wife again until next morning at 11 o'clock. "Good gracious me," she cried, rushing down the stairs in dressing-gown and slippers. "Albert, just look at the time. I must have slept 12 hours at least. Is everything all right? What happened?" He was sitting quietly in his armchair, smoking a pipe and reading the morning paper. The baby was in a sort of carry-cot on the floor at his feet, sleeping. "Hello, dear," he said, smiling. She ran over to the cot and looked in. "Did she take anything, Albert? How many times have you fed her? She was due for another one at 10 o'clock. Did you know that?" Albert Taylor folded the newspaper neatly into a square and put it away on the side table. "I fed her at 2 in the morning," he said, "and she took about half an ounce, no more. I fed her again at 6, and she did a bit better than that. 2 ounces. 2 ounces? Oh, Albert, that's marvellous. And we just finished the last feed 10 minutes ago. There's the bottle on the mantelpiece. Only 1 ounce left. She drank 3. How's that?" He was grinning proudly, delighted with his achievement. The woman quickly got down on her knees and peered at the baby. "Doesn't she look better?" he asked eagerly. "Don't she look fatter in the face?" "It may sound silly," the wife said, "but I actually think she does. Oh, Albert, you're a marvel. How did you do it?" "She's turning the corner," he said. "That's all it is, just like the doctor prophesied. She's turning the corner." "I pray to God you're right, Albert. Of course I'm right. From now on, you watch her go." The woman was gazing lovingly at the baby. "You look a lot better yourself too, Mabel." "I feel wonderful. I'm sorry about last night." "Let's keep it this way," he said. "I'll do all the night feeds in future. You do the day ones." She looked up at him across the cot, frowning. "No," she said. "Oh, no, I wouldn't allow you to do that." "I don't want you to have a breakdown, Mabel." "I won't. Not now I've had some sleep. Much better we share it." "No, Albert, this is my job, and I intend to do it. Last night won't happen again." There was a pause. Albert Taylor took the pipe out of his mouth and examined the grain on the bowl. "All right," he said. "In that case, I'll just relieve you of the donkey work. I'll do all the sterilizing and the mixing of the food and getting everything ready. That'll help you a bit anyway." She looked at him carefully, wondering what could have come over him all of a sudden. "You see, Mabel, I've been thinking." "Yes, dear?" "I've been thinking that up till last night, I've never even raised a finger to help you with this baby." "That isn't true." "Oh, yes, it is. So I've decided that from now on, I'm going to do my share of the work. I'm going to be the feed mixer and the bottle sterilizer. Right?" It's very sweet of you, dear, but I really don't think it's necessary. Come on, he cried. Don't change the look. I've done it the last 3 times, and just look what happened. When's the next one? 2 o'clock, isn't it? Yes, it's all mixed, he said. Everything's all mixed and ready, and all you've got to do when the time comes is to go out there to the larder and take it off the shelf and warm it up. That's some help, isn't it? The woman got up off her knees and went over to him and kissed him on the cheek. You're such a nice man, she said. I love you more and more every day I know you. Later, in the middle of the afternoon, when Albert was outside in the sunshine working among the hives, he heard her calling to him from the house. "Albert!" she shouted. "Albert, come here!" She was running through the buttercups toward him. He started forward to meet her, wondering what was wrong. "Oh, Albert, guess what?" "What?" "I've just finished giving her the 2 o'clock feed, and she's taken the whole lot." "No." "Every drop of it. Oh, Albert, I'm so happy. She's going to be all right. She's turned the corner, just like you said." She came up to him and threw her arms round his neck and hugged him, and he clapped her on the back and laughed and said what a marvellous little mother she was. "Will you come in and watch the next one and see if she does it again, Albert?" He told her he wouldn't miss it for anything, and she hugged him again, then turned and ran back into the house, skipping over the grass and singing all the way. Naturally, there was a certain amount of suspense in the air as the time approached for the 6 o'clock feed. By 5:30, both parents were already seated in the living room, waiting for the moment to arrive. The bottle with the milk formula in it was standing in a saucepan of warm water on the mantelpiece. The baby was asleep in its carry-cot on the sofa. At 20 minutes to 6, it woke up and started screaming its head off. "There you are!" Mrs. Taylor cried. "She's asking for the bottle. Pick her up quick, Albert, and hand her to me here. Give me the bottle first." He gave her the bottle, then placed the baby on the woman's lap. Cautiously, she touched the baby's lips with the end of the nipple. The baby seized the nipple between its gums and began to suck ravenously with a rapid, powerful action. "Oh, Albert, isn't it wonderful?" she said, laughing. "It's terrific, Mabel." In 7 or 8 minutes, the entire contents of the bottle had disappeared down the baby's throat. "You clever girl," Mrs. Taylor said. 4 ounces again." Albert Taylor was leaning forward in his chair, peering intently into the baby's face. "You know what?" he said. "She even seems as though she's put on a touch of weight already. What do you think?" The mother looked down at the child. "Don't she seem bigger and fatter to you, Mabel, than she was yesterday?" "Maybe she does, Albert, I'm not sure. Although, actually, there couldn't be any real gain in such a short time as this. The important thing is that she's eating normally." "She's turned the corner," Albert said. "I don't think you need worry about her any more." "I certainly won't. You want me to go up and fetch the cradle back into our own bedroom, Mabel?" "Yes, please," she said. Albert went upstairs and moved the cradle. The woman followed with the baby, and after changing its nappy, she laid it gently down on its bed. Then she covered it with sheet and blanket. "Doesn't she look lovely, Albert?" she whispered. "Isn't that the most beautiful baby you've ever seen in your entire life?" "Leave her now, Mabel," he said. "Come on downstairs and cook us a bit of supper. We both deserve it." After they had finished eating, the parents settled themselves in armchairs in the living room, Albert with his magazine and his pipe, Mrs. Taylor with her knitting. But this was a very different scene from the one of the night before. Suddenly all tensions had vanished. Mrs. Taylor's handsome oval face was glowing with pleasure. Her cheeks were pink, her eyes were sparkling bright, and her mouth was fixed in a little dreamy smile of pure content. Every now and again she would glance up from her knitting and gaze affectionately at her husband. Occasionally she would stop the clicking of her needles altogether for a few seconds and sit quite still, looking at the ceiling, listening for a cry or a whimper from upstairs. But all was quiet. "Albert," she said after a while. "Yes, dear?" "What was it you were going to tell me last night when you came rushing up to the bedroom? You said you had an idea for the baby." Albert Taylor lowered the magazine onto his lap and gave her a long, sly look. "Did I?" he said. "Yes." She waited for him to go on, but he didn't. "What's the big joke?" she asked. "Why are you grinning like that?" "It's a joke, all right," he he said. "Tell it to me, dear." "I'm not sure I ought to," he said. "You might call me a liar." She had seldom seen him look so pleased with himself as he was now, and she smiled back at him, egging him on. "I'd just like to see your face when you hear it, Mabel. That's all." "Albert, what is all this?" He paused, refusing to be hurried. "You do think the baby's better, don't you?" he asked. "Of course I do." "You agree with me that all of a sudden she's feeding marvellously and looking 100% different?" "I do, Albert, yes." "That's good," he said, the grin widening. "You see, it's me that did it." "Did what?" "I cured the baby." "Yes, dear, I'm sure you did." Mrs. Taylor went right on with her knitting. "You don't believe me, do you?" "Of course I believe you, Albert. I give you all the credit, every bit of it." "Then how did I do it?" "Well," she said, pausing a moment to think, I suppose it's simply that you're a brilliant feed mixer. Ever since you started mixing the feeds, she's got better and better." "You mean there's some sort of art in mixing the feeds?" "Apparently there is." She was knitting away and smiling quietly to herself, thinking how funny men were. "I'll tell you a secret," he said. "You're absolutely right. Although, mind you, it isn't so much how you mix it that counts. It's what you put in. You realize that, don't you, Mabel?" Mrs. Taylor stopped knitting and looked up sharply at her husband. "Albert," she said, "don't tell me you've been putting things into that child's milk." He sat there grinning. "Well, have you or haven't you?" "It's possible," he said. "I don't believe it." He had a strange, fierce way of grinning that showed his teeth. "Albert," she said, "stop playing about with me like this." "Yes, dear, all right. You haven't really put anything into her milk, have you? Answer me properly, Albert. This could be serious with such a tiny baby." "The answer is yes, Mabel." "Albert Taylor, how could you—" "Now, don't get excited," he said. "I'll tell you all about it if you really want me to, but for heaven's sake, keep your hair on." "It was beer," she cried. "I just know it was beer." "Don't be so daft, Mabel, please." "Then what was it?" Albert laid his pipe down carefully on the table beside him and leaned back in his chair. "Tell me," he said, "did you ever by any chance happen to hear me mention something called royal jelly?" "I did not." "It's magic," he said, "pure magic. And last night I suddenly got the idea that if I was to put some of this into the baby's milk—" "How dare you!" "Now, Mabel, you don't even know what it is yet." "I don't care what it is," she said. "You can't go putting foreign bodies like that into a tiny baby's milk. You must be mad." "It's perfectly harmless, Mabel. Otherwise I wouldn't have done it. It comes from the bees. I might have guessed that. And it's so precious that practically no one can afford to take it. When they do, it's only one little drop at a time." "And how much did you give to our baby, might I ask?" "Ah," he said, "that's the whole point. That's where the difference lies. I reckon that our baby, just in the last 4 feeds, has already swallowed about 50 times as much royal jelly as anyone else in the world has ever swallowed before. How about that?" "Albert, stop pulling my leg." "I swear it," he said proudly. She sat there, staring at him, her brow wrinkled, her mouth slightly open. "You know what this stuff actually costs, Mabel, if you want to buy it. There's a place in America advertising it for sale at this very moment for something like $500 a pound jar. $500. That's more than gold, you know." She hadn't the faintest idea what he was talking about. "I'll prove it," he said, and he jumped up and went across to the large bookcase where he kept all his literature about bees. On the top shelf, the back numbers of the American Bee Journal were neatly stacked alongside those of the British Bee Journal, Beecraft, and other magazines. He took down the last issue of the American Bee Journal and turned to a page of small classified advertisements at the back. "Here you are," he said, "exactly as I told you. We sell royal jelly, $480 per pound jar wholesale." He handed her the magazine so she could read it herself. "Now do you believe me? This is an actual shop in New York. It says so. It doesn't say you can go stirring it into the milk of a practically newborn baby. I don't know what's come over you, Albert. I really don't." "It's curing her, isn't it?" "I'm not so sure about that now. Don't be so damn silly, Mabel. You know it is. Then why haven't other people done it with their babies? I keep telling you, he said, it's too expensive. Practically nobody in the world can afford to buy royal jelly just for eating, except maybe 1 or 2 millionaires, multimillionaires. The people who buy it are the big companies that make women's face creams and things like that. They're using it as a stunt. They make a tiny pinch of it into a big jar of face cream, and it's selling like hotcakes for absolutely enormous prices. They claim it takes out the wrinkles. And does it? Now, how on earth would I know that, Mabel? Anyway, he said, returning to his chair. That's not the point. The point is this. It's done so much good to our little baby just in the last few hours that I think we ought to go right on giving it to her. Now, don't interrupt, Mabel. Let me finish. I've got 240 hives out there, and if I turn over maybe 100 of them to making royal jelly, we ought to be able to supply her with all that she wants. Albert Taylor, the woman said, stretching her eyes wide and staring at him, have you gone out of your mind? I forbid it, she said. Absolutely. You're not to give my baby another drop of that horrid jelly, you understand? Now, Mabel, and quite apart from that, we had a shocking honey crop last year, and if you go fooling around with those hives now, there's no telling what might happen. There's nothing wrong with my hives, Mabel. You know very well, we had only half the noble crop last year. Do me a favour, will you? He said. Let me explain some of the marvellous things this stuff does. You haven't even told me what this royal jelly is yet. All right, Mabel, I'll do that too. Will you listen? Will you give me a chance to explain it? She sighed and picked up her knitting once more. I suppose you might as well get it off your chest. Go on, Albert. Tell me. He paused, a bit uncertain now how to begin. It wasn't going to be easy to explain something like this to a person with no detailed knowledge of apiculture at all. You know, don't you, he said, that each colony only has one queen? Yes. And that this queen lays all the eggs? Yes, dear, that much I know. All right. Now, the queen can actually lay 2 different kinds of eggs. You didn't know that, but she can. It's what we call one of the miracles of the hive. She can lay eggs that produce drones, and she can lay eggs that produce workers. Now, if that isn't a miracle, Mabel, I don't know what is. Yes, Albert, all right. The drones are the males. We don't have to worry about them. The workers are all females. So is the queen, of course. But the workers are unsexed females, if you see what I mean. Their organs are completely undeveloped, whereas the queen is tremendously sexy. She can actually lay her own weight in eggs in a single day. He hesitated, marshalling his thoughts. Now, what happens is this. The queen crawls around on the comb and lays her eggs in what we call cells. In all those hundreds of little holes you see in a honeycomb, well, a brood comb is just about the same, except the cells don't have honey in them. They have eggs. She lays 1 egg to each cell, and in 3 days each of these eggs hatches out into a tiny grub. We call it a larva. Now, as soon as this larva appears, the nurse bees, their young workers, all crowd round and start feeding it like mad. And you know what they feed it on? Royal jelly. Mabel answered patiently. Right, he cried. That's exactly what they do feed it on. They get this stuff out of a gland in their heads, and they start pumping it into the cells to feed the larva. And what happens then? He paused dramatically, blinking at her with his small, watery grey eyes. Then he turned slowly in his chair and reached for the magazine that he had been reading the night before. You want to know what happens then? He asked, wetting his lips. I can hardly wait. Royal jelly, he read aloud, must be a substance of tremendous nourishing power. For, on this diet alone, the honeybee larva increases in weight 1,500 times in 5 days. How much? 1,500 times, Mabel. And you know what that means, if you put it in terms of a human being. It means, he said, lowering his voice, leaning forward, fixing her with those small, pale eyes of his, it means that in 5 days a baby weighing 7.5 pounds to start off with would increase in weight to 5 tons. For the second time, Mrs. Taylor stopped knitting. Now, you mustn't take that too literally, Mabel. Who says I mustn't? It's just a scientific way of putting it, that's all. Very well, Albert. Go on. But that's only half the story, he said. There's more to come. The really amazing thing about royal jelly I haven't told you yet. I'm going to show you now how it can transform a plain, dull-looking little worker bee with practically no sex organs at all into a great, big, beautiful, fertile queen. Are you saying our baby is dull-looking and plain? She asked sharply. Now, don't go putting words into my mouth, Mabel, please. Just listen to this. Did you know that the queen bee and the worker bee, although they are completely different when they grow up, are both hatched out of exactly the same kind of egg? I don't believe that, she said. It's true as I'm sitting here, Mabel, honest it is. Any time the bees want a queen to hatch out of the egg instead of a worker, they can do it. How? Ah, he said, shaking a thick forefinger in her direction. That's just what I'm coming to. That's the secret of the whole thing. Now, what do you think it is, Mabel, that makes this miracle happen? Royal jelly, she answered. You already told me. Royal jelly it is, he cried, clapping his hands and bouncing upon his seat. His big round face was glowing with excitement now, and two vivid patches of scarlet had appeared high up on each cheek. Here's how it works. I'll put it very simply for you. The bees want a new queen. So they build an extra-large cell, a queen cell we call it, and they get the old queen to lay one of her eggs in there. The other 1,999 eggs she lays in ordinary worker cells. Now, as soon as these eggs hatch into larvae, the nurse bees rally round and start pumping in the royal jelly. All of them get it, workers as well as queen. But here's the vital thing, Mabel, so listen carefully. Here's where the difference comes. The worker larvae only receive this special marvellous food for the first 3 days of their larval life. After that, they have a complete change of diet. What really happens is they get weaned, except that it's not like an ordinary weaning because it's so sudden. After the 3rd day, they're put straight away onto more or less routine bees' food, a mixture of honey and pollen. And then, about 2 weeks later, they emerge from the cell as workers. But not so the larva in the queen cell. This one gets royal jelly all the way through its larval life. The nurse bees simply pour it into the cell, so much so, in fact, that the little larva is literally floating in it, and that's what makes it into a queen. You can't prove it, she said. Don't talk so damn silly, Mabel, please. Thousands of people have proved it time and time again, famous scientists in every corner of the world. All you have to do is to take a larva out of a worker cell and put it in a queen cell. That's what we call grafting. And just so long as the nurse bee keeps it well supplied with royal jelly, then presto, it's grown up into a queen. And what makes it more marvellous still is the absolutely enormous difference between a queen and a worker when they grow up. The abdomen is a different shape. The sting is different. The legs are different. In what way are the legs different? She asked him, testing him. The legs? Well, the workers have little pollen baskets on their legs for carrying the pollen. The queen has none. Now here's another thing. The queen has fully developed sex organs. The workers don't. And most amazing of all, Mabel, the queen lives for an average of 4 to 6 years. The worker hardly lives that many months. And all this difference simply because one of them got royal jelly and the other didn't. It's pretty hard to believe, she said, that a food can do all that. Of course, it's hard to believe. It's another of the miracles of the hive. In fact, it's the biggest rudder miracle of them all. It's such a hell of a big miracle that it's baffled the great men of science for hundreds of years. Wait a moment. Stay here. Don't move. Again, he jumped up and went over to the bookcase and started rummaging among the books and magazines. I'm going to find you a few of the reports. Here we are. Here's one of them. Listen to this. He started reading aloud from a copy of the American Bee Journal. Living in Toronto, at the head of a fine research laboratory given to him by the people of Canada in recognition of his truly great contribution to humanity in the discovery of insulin, Dr. Frederick A. Banting became curious about royal jelly. He requested his staff to do a basic fractional analysis. He paused. Well, there's no need to read it all, but here's what happened. Dr. Banting and his people took some royal jelly from queen cells that contained 2-day-old larvae, and then they started analyzing it. And what do you think they found? They found, he said, that royal jelly contains phenols, sterols, glycerols, dextrose, and now here it comes, and 80 to 85% Unidentified acids. He stood beside the bookcase with the magazine in his hand, smiling a funny little furtive smile of triumph, and his wife watched him, bewildered. He was not a tall man. He had a thick, plump, pulpy-looking body that was built close to the ground on abbreviated legs. The legs were slightly bowed. The head was huge and round, covered with bristly, short-cut hair, and the greater part of the face, now that he had given up shaving altogether, was hidden by a brownish-yellow fuzz about an inch long. In one way and another, he was rather grotesque to look at. There was no denying that. 80 to 85%, he said. Unidentified acids. Isn't that fantastic? He turned back to the bookshelf and began hunting through the other magazines. What does it mean, unidentified acids? That's the whole point. No one knows. Not even Banting could find out. You've heard of Banting? No. He just happens to be about the most famous living doctor in the world today, that's all. Looking at him now, as he buzzed around in front of the bookcase, with his bristly head and his hairy face and his plump, pulpy body, she couldn't help thinking that somehow, in some curious way, there was a touch of the bee about this man. She had often seen women grow to look like the horses that they rode, and she had noticed that people who bred birds, or bull-terriers, or Pomeranians, frequently resembled in some small but startling manner the creature of their choice. But up until now, it had never occurred to her that her husband might look like a bee. It shocked her a bit. And did Banting ever try to eat it? She asked. This royal jelly? Of course he didn't eat it, Mabel. He didn't have enough for that. It's too precious. You know something, she said, staring at him, but smiling a little all the same. You're getting to look just a teeny bit like a bee yourself. Did you know that? He turned and looked at her. I suppose it's the beard, mostly, she said. I should stop wearing it. Even the colour is sort of bee-ish, don't you think? What the hell are you talking about, Mabel? Albert, she said, your language. Do you want to hear any more of this, or don't you? Yes, dear, I'm sorry. I was only joking. Do go on. He turned away again and pulled another magazine out of the bookcase and began leafing through the pages. Now, listen to this, Mabel. In 1939, Hale experimented with 21-day-old rats, injecting them with royal jelly in varying amounts. As a result, he found a precocious follicular development of the ovaries, directly in proportion to the quantity of royal jelly injected. There, she cried. I knew it. Knew what? I knew something terrible would happen. Nonsense. There's nothing wrong with that. Now, here's another, Mabel. Still, Burdett found that a male rat, which hitherto had been unable to breed, upon receiving a minute daily dose of royal jelly, became a father many times over. Albert, she cried, this stuff is much too strong to give to a baby. I don't like it at all. Nonsense, Mabel. Then why do they only try it out on rats? Tell me that. Why don't some of these famous scientists take it themselves? They're too clever, that's why. Do you think Dr. Banting is going to risk finishing up with precious ovaries? Not him. But they have given it to people, Mabel. Here's a whole article about it. Listen. He turned the page and again began reading from the magazine. In Mexico, in 1953, a group of enlightened physicians began prescribing minute doses of royal jelly for such things as cerebral neuritis, arthritis, diabetes, auto-intoxication from tobacco, impotence in men, asthma, croup, and gout. There are stacks of signed testimonials. A celebrated stockbroker in Mexico City contracted a particularly stubborn case of psoriasis. He became physically unattractive. His clients began to forsake him. His business began to suffer. In desperation, he turned to royal jelly, 1 drop with every meal, and presto, he was cured in a fortnight. A waiter in the Café Jenna, also in Mexico City, reported that his father, after taking minute doses of this wonder substitute in capsule form, sired a healthy child at the age of 90. A bullfighter promoter in Acapulco, finding himself landed with a rather lethargic-looking bull, injected it with 1 gram of royal jelly, an excessive dose, just before it entered the arena. Thereupon the beast became so swift and savage that it promptly dispatched 2 picadors, 3 horses, and a matador. And finally, listen, Mrs. Taylor said, interrupting him. I think the baby's crying. Albert glanced up from his reading. Sure enough, a lusty yelling noise was coming from the bedroom above. "She must be hungry," he said. His wife looked at the clock. "Good gracious me," she cried, jumping up. "It's past her time again already. You mix the feed, Albert, quickly, while I bring her down. But hurry, I don't want to keep her waiting." In half a minute, Mrs. Taylor was back, carrying the screaming infant in her arms. She was flustered now, still quite unaccustomed to the ghastly, non-stop racket that a healthy baby makes when it wants its food. "Do be quick, Albert," she called, settling herself in the armchair and arranging the child on her lap. "Please hurry." Albert entered from the kitchen and handed her the bottle of warm milk. "It's just right," he said. "You don't have to test it." She hitched the baby's head a little higher in the crook of her arm, then pushed the rubber teat straight into the wide-open, yelling mouth. The baby grabbed the teat and began to suck. The yelling stopped. Mrs. Taylor relaxed. "Oh, Albert, isn't she lovely?" "She's terrific, Mabel. Thanks to royal jelly. Now, dear, I don't want to hear another word about that nasty stuff. It frightens me to death." "You're making a big mistake," he said. "We'll see about that," the baby went on, sucking the bottle. "I do believe she's going to finish the whole lot again, Albert." "I'm sure she is," he said. And a few minutes later, the milk was all gone. "Oh, what a good girl you are," Mrs. Taylor cried, as very gently she started to withdraw the nipple. The baby sensed what she was doing and sucked harder, trying to hold on. The woman gave a little tug, and plop, out it came. "Wah, wah, wah," the baby yelled. "Nasty old wind," Mrs. Taylor said, hoisting the child onto her shoulder and patting its back. It belched twice in quick succession. "There you are, my darling. You're all right now." For a few seconds the yelling stopped. Then it started again. "Keep belching her," Albert said. "She's drunk it too quick." His wife lifted the baby back onto her shoulder. She rubbed its spine. She changed it from one shoulder to the other. She laid it on its stomach, on her lap. She sat it up on her knee, but it didn't belch again, and the yelling became louder and more insistent every minute. "Good for the lungs," Albert Taylor said, grinning. "That's the way they exercise their lungs. Did you know that, Mabel?" "There, there, there," the wife said, kissing it all over the face. "There, there, there." They waited another 5 minutes, but not for one moment did the screaming stop. "Change the nappy," Albert said. "It's got a wet nappy, that's all it is." He fetched a clean one from the kitchen, and Mrs. Taylor took the old one off and put the new one on. This made no difference at all. "Wow, wow," the baby yelled. "You didn't stick the safety pin through the skin, did you, Mabel?" "Of course I didn't," she said, feeling under the nappy with her fingers to make sure. The parents sat opposite one another in their armchairs, smiling nervously, watching the baby on the mother's lap, waiting for it to tire and stop screaming. "You know what?" Albert Taylor said at last. "What?" "I'll bet she's still hungry. I'll bet all she wants is another swig of that bottle. How about me fetching her an extra lot?" "Oh, I don't think we ought to do that, Albert." "It'll do her good," he said, getting up from the chair. "I'm going to warm up her second helping." He went into the kitchen and was away several minutes. When he returned, he was holding a bottle brimful of milk. "I made her a double," he announced. 8 ounces, just in case." "Albert, are you mad? Don't you know it's just as bad to overfeed as it is to underfeed?" "You don't have to give her the lot, Mabel. You can stop any time you like. Go on," he said, standing over her. "Give her a drink." Mrs. Taylor began to tease the baby's upper lip with the end of the nipple. The tiny mouth closed like a trap over the rubber teat, and suddenly there was a silence in the room. The baby's whole body relaxed, and a look of absolute bliss came over its face as it started to drink. "There you are, Mabel. What did I tell you?" The woman didn't answer. "She's ravenous, that's what she is. Just look at her suck." Mrs. Taylor was watching the level of the milk in the bottle. It was dropping fast, and before long 3 or 4 ounces out of the 8 had disappeared. "There," she said. "That'll do." "You can't pull it away now, Mabel." "Yes, dear, I must." "Go on, woman. Give her the rest. Stop fussing." "But, Albert, she's famished. Can't you see that? Go on, my beauty," he said. "You finish the bottle." "I don't like it, Albert," the wife said. But she didn't pull the bottle away. "She's making up for lost time, Mabel. That's all she's doing." 5 minutes later the bottle was empty. Slowly, Mrs. Taylor withdrew the nipple, and this time there was no protest from the baby, no sound at all. It lay peacefully on the mother's lap, the eyes glazed with contentment, the mouth half open, the lips smeared with milk. 12 whole ounces, Mabel, Albert Taylor said. 3 times the normal amount. Isn't that amazing? The woman was staring down at the baby, and now the old, anxious, tight-lipped look of the frightened mother was slowly returning to her face. "What's the matter with you?" Albert asked. "You're not worried by that, are you? You can't expect to get back to normal on a lousy 4 ounces. Don't be ridiculous." "Come here, Albert," she said. "What?" "I said, come here." He went over and stood beside her. "Take a look and tell me if you see anything different." He peered closely at the baby. "She seems bigger, Mabel, if that's what you mean. Bigger and fatter." "Hold her," she ordered. "Go on, pick her up." He reached out and lifted the baby off the mother's lap. "Good God," he cried, "she weighs a ton." "Exactly." "Now, isn't that marvellous?" he cried, beaming. "I'll bet she must be back to normal already." "It frightens me, Albert. It's too quick." "Nonsense, woman. It's that disgusting jelly that's done it. I hate the stuff." "There's nothing disgusting about royal jelly," he answered indignantly. "Don't be a fool, Albert. You think it's normal for a child to start putting on weight at this speed? You're never satisfied. You're scared stiff when she's losing, and now you're absolutely terrified because she's gaining. What's the matter with you, Mabel?" The woman got up from her chair with the baby in her arms and started toward the door. "All I can say is," she said, "it's lucky I'm here to see you don't give her any more of it. That's all I can say." She went out, and Albert watched her through the open door as she crossed the hall to the foot of the stairs and started to ascend, and when she reached the 3rd or 4th step she suddenly stopped and stood quite still for several seconds as though remembering something. Then she returned and came down again rather quickly and re-entered the room. "Albert," she said. "Yes?" "I assume there wasn't any royal jelly in this last feed you've just given her." "I don't see why you should assume that, Mabel." "Albert!" "What's wrong?" he asked, soft and innocent. "How dare you!" she cried. Albert Taylor's great bearded face took on a pained and puzzled look. "I think you ought to be very glad she's got another big dose of it inside her," he said. "Honest, I do. And this is a big dose, Mabel. Believe you me." The woman was standing just inside the doorway, clasping the sleeping baby in her arms, and staring at her husband with huge eyes. She stood very erect, her body absolutely stiff with fury, her face paler, more tight-lipped than ever. "You mark my words," Albert was saying. "You're going to have a nipper there soon that'll win first prize in any baby show in the entire country. Hey, why don't you weigh her now and see what she is? You want me to get the scales, Mabel, so you can weigh her?" The woman walked straight over to the large table in the centre of the room and laid the baby down and quickly started taking off its clothes. "Yes," she snapped, "get the scales." Off came the little nightgown, then the undervest. Then she unpinned the nappy, and she drew it away, and the baby lay naked on the table. "But, Mabel," Albert cried, "it's a miracle. She's fat as a puppy." Indeed, the amount of flesh the child had put on since the day before was astounding. The small, sunken chest with the rib bones showing all over it was now plump and round as a barrel, and the belly was bulging high in the air. Curiously, though, the arms and legs did not seem to have grown in proportion. Still short and skinny, they looked like little sticks protruding from a ball of fat. "Look," Albert said, "she's even beginning to get a bit of fuzz on the tummy to keep her warm." He put out a hand and was about to run the tips of his fingers over the powdering of silky, yellowy brown hairs that had suddenly appeared on the baby's stomach. "Don't you touch her!" the woman cried. She turned and faced him, her eyes blazing, and she looked suddenly like some kind of little fighting bird with her neck arched over towards him, as though she were about to fly at his face and peck his eyes out. "Now, wait a minute," he said, retreating. "You must be mad," she cried. Now wait just 1 minute, Mabel, will you please? Because if you're thinking this stuff is dangerous, that is what you're thinking, isn't it? All right, then listen carefully. I shall now proceed to prove to you once and for all, Mabel, that royal jelly is absolutely harmless to human beings, even in enormous doses. For example, why do you think we only had half the usual honey crop last summer? Tell me that. His retreat, walking backwards, had taken him 3 or 4 yards away from her, where he seemed to feel more comfortable. The reason we had only half the crop last summer, he said slowly, lowering his voice, was because I turned 100 of my hives over to the production of royal jelly. You what? Ah, he whispered, I thought that might surprise you a bit, and I've been making it ever since, right under your very nose. His small eyes were glinting at her, and a slow, sly smile was creeping around the corners of his mouth. You'll never guess the reason, either, he said. I've been afraid to mention it up to now, because I thought it might, well, sort of embarrass you. There was a slight pause. He had his hands clasped high in front of him, level with his chest. He was rubbing one palm against the other, making a soft, scraping noise. You remember that bit I read you out of the magazine? That bit about the rat? Let me see now, how does it go? Still and Birded found that a male rat, which hitherto had been unable to breed... He hesitated, the grin widening, showing his teeth. You get the message, Mabel? She stood quite still, facing him. The very first time I read that sentence, Mabel, I jumped straight out of my chair and I said to myself, if it'll work with a lousy rat, I said, then there's no reason on earth why it shouldn't work with Albert Taylor. He paused again, craning his head forward and turning one ear slightly in his wife's direction, waiting for her to say something, but she didn't. And there's another thing, he went on. It made me feel so absolutely marvellous, Mabel, and sort of completely different to what I was before, that I went right on taking it after you'd announced the joyful tidings. Buckets of it I must have swallowed during the last 12 months. The big, heavy, haunted-looking eyes of the woman were moving intently over the man's face and neck. There was no skin showing at all on the neck, not even at the sides, below the ears. The whole of it, to a point where it disappeared into the collar of the shirt, was covered all the way around with those shortish, silky hairs, yellowy black. Mind you, he said, turning away from her, gazing lovingly now at the baby. It's going to work far better on a tiny infant than on a fully developed man like me. You've only got to look at her to see that. Don't you agree? The woman's eyes travelled slowly downward and settled on the baby. The baby was lying naked on the table, fat and white and comatose, like some gigantic grub that was approaching the end of its larval life and would soon emerge into the world complete with mandibles and wings. Why don't you cover her up, Mabel? He said. We don't want our little queen to catch cold.
Georgie Porgy. Without in any way wishing to blow my own trumpet, I think that I can claim to being in most respects a moderately well-matured and rounded individual. I have travelled a good deal. I am adequately read. I speak Greek and Latin. I dabble in science. I can tolerate a mildly liberal attitude in the politics of others. I have compiled a volume of notes upon the evolution of the madrigal in the 15th century. I have witnessed the death of a large number of persons in their beds, and in addition I have influenced, at least I hope I have, the lives of quite a few others by the spoken word delivered from the pulpit. Yet in spite of all this, I must confess that I have never in my life, well, how shall I put it? I have never really had anything much to do with women. To be perfectly honest, up until 3 weeks ago, I had never so much as laid a finger on one of them, except perhaps to help her over a stile or something like that when the occasion demanded. And even then I always tried to ensure that I touched only the shoulder or the waist or some other place where the skin was covered, because the one thing I never could stand was actual contact between my skin and theirs. Skin touching skin, my skin, that is, touching the skin of a female, whether it were leg, neck, face, hand, or merely finger, was so repugnant to me that I invariably greeted a lady with my hands clasped firmly behind my back to avoid the inevitable handshake. I could go further than that and say that any sort of physical contact with them, even when the skin wasn't bare, would disturb me considerably. If a woman stood close to me in a queue, so that our bodies touched, or if she squeezed in beside me on a bus seat, hip to hip, and thigh to thigh, my cheeks would begin burning like mad, and little prickles of sweat would start coming out all over the crown of my head. This condition is all very well in a schoolboy who has just reached the age of puberty. With him it is simply Dame Nature's way of putting on the brakes and holding the lad back until he is old enough to behave himself like a gentleman. I approve of that. But there was no reason on God's earth why I, at the ripe old age of 31, should continue to suffer a similar embarrassment. I was well trained to resist temptation, and I was certainly not given to vulgar passions. Had I been even the slightest bit ashamed of my own personal appearance, then that might possibly have explained the whole thing, but I was not, on the contrary. And though I say it myself, the fates had been rather kind to me in that regard. I stood exactly 5.5 feet tall in my stockinged feet, and my shoulders, though they sloped downward a little from the neck, were nicely balanced with my small, neat frame. Personally, I've always thought that a little slope on the shoulders lends a subtle and faintly aesthetic air to a man who is not overly tall, don't you agree? My features were regular, my teeth were in excellent condition, protruding only a smallish amount from the upper jaw, and my hair, which was an unusually brilliant ginger red, grew thickly all over my scalp. Good heavens above, I had seen men who were perfect shrimps in comparison with me displaying an astonishing aplomb in their dealings with the fairer sex. And oh, how I envied them, how I longed to do likewise, to be able to share in a few of those pleasant little rituals of contact that I observed continually taking place between men and women, the touching of hands, the peck on the cheek, the linking of arms, the pressure of knee against knee or foot against foot under the dining table, and most of all, the full-blown, violent embrace that comes when two of them join together on the floor for a dance. But such things were not for me. Alas, I had to spend my time avoiding them instead, and this, my friends, was easier said than done, even for a humble curate in a small country region, far from the flesh-pots of the metropolis. My flock, you understand, contained an inordinate number of ladies. There were scores of them in the parish, and the unfortunate thing about it was that at least 60% of them were spinsters, completely untamed by the benevolent influence of holy matrimony. I tell you, I was as jumpy as a squirrel. One would have thought that with all the careful training my mother had given me as a child, I should have been capable of taking this sort of thing well in my stride, and no doubt I would have done if only she had lived long enough to complete my education. But alas, she was killed when I was still quite young. She was a wonderful woman, my mother. She used to wear huge bracelets on her wrists, 5 or 6 of them at a time, with all sorts of things hanging from them and tinkling against each other as she moved. It didn't matter where she was, you could always find her by listening for the noise of those bracelets. It was better than a cowbell, and in the evenings she used to sit on the sofa in her black trousers, with her feet tucked up underneath her, smoking endless cigarettes from a long black holder, and I'd be crouching on the floor, watching her. "You want to taste my martini, George?" she used to ask. "Now stop it, Claire," my father would say. "If you're not careful, you'll stunt the boy's growth." "Go on," she said. "Don't be frightened of it. Drink it." I always did everything my mother told me. "That's enough," my father said. "He only has to know what it tastes like. Please don't interfere, Boris. This is very important." My mother had a theory that nothing in the world should be kept secret from a child. Show him everything. Make him experience it. I'm not going to have any boy of mine going around whispering dirty secrets with other children and having to guess about this thing and that simply because no one will tell him. Tell him everything. Make him listen. Come over here, George, and I'll tell you what there is to know about God. She never read stories to me at night before I went to bed. She just told me things instead, and every evening it was something different. Come over here, George, because now I'm going to tell you about Mohammed. She would be sitting on the sofa in her black trousers, with her legs crossed and her feet tucked up underneath her, and she'd beckon to me in a queer, languorous manner with the hand that held the long, black cigarette holder, and the bangles would start jingling all the way up her arm. If you must have a religion, I suppose Mohammedanism is as good as any of them. It's all based on keeping healthy. You have lots of wives, and you mustn't ever smoke or drink. Why mustn't you smoke or drink, Mummy? Because if you've got lots of wives, you have to keep healthy and virile. What is virile? I'll go into that tomorrow, my pet. Let's deal with one subject at a time. Another thing about the Mohammedan is that he never gets constipated. Now, Claire, my father would say, looking up from his book, stick to the facts. My dear Boris, you don't know anything about it. Now, if only you would try bending forward and touching the ground with your forehead morning, noon and night, every day, facing Mecca, you might have a bit less trouble in that direction yourself. I used to love listening to her. Even though I could only understand about half of what she was saying, she really was telling me secrets, and there wasn't anything more exciting than that. Come over here, George, and I'll tell you precisely how your father makes his money. Now, Claire, that's quite enough. Nonsense, darling. Why make a secret out of it with the child? He'll only imagine something much worse. I was exactly 10 years old when she started giving me detailed lectures on the subject of sex. This was the biggest secret of them all, and therefore the most enthralling. Come over here, George, because now I'm going to tell you how you came into this world, right from the very beginning. I saw my father glance up quietly and open his mouth wide, the way he did when he was going to say something vital, but my mother was already fixing him with those brilliant, shining eyes of hers, and he went slowly back to his book without uttering a sound. Your poor father is embarrassed, she said, and she gave me her private smile, the one that she gave nobody else, only to me, the one-sided smile where just one corner of her mouth lifted slowly upward until it made a lovely long wrinkle that stretched right to the eye itself and became a sort of wink smile instead. Embarrassment, my pet, is the one thing that I want you never to feel, and don't think for a moment that your father is embarrassed only because of you. My father started wriggling about in his chair. My God, he's even embarrassed about things like that when he's alone with me, his own wife. About things like what? I asked. At that point my father got up and quietly left the room. I think it must have been about a week after this that my mother was killed. It may possibly have been a little later, 10 days or a fortnight, I can't be sure. All I know is that we were getting near the end of this particular series of talks when it happened, and because I myself was personally involved in the brief chain of events that led up to her death, I can still remember every single detail of that curious night, just as clearly as if it were yesterday. I can switch it on in my memory any time I like and run it through in front of my eyes exactly as though it were the reel of a cinema film, and it never varies. It always ends at precisely the same place, no more and no less, and it always begins in the same peculiarly sudden way, with the screen in darkness and my mother's voice somewhere above me calling my name. George, wake up! George, wake up! And then there is a bright electric light dazzling in my eyes, and right from the very centre of it, but far away, the voice is still calling me. George, wake up and get out of bed and put your dressing gown on. Quickly, you're coming downstairs. There's something I want you to see. Come on, child, come on, hurry up, and put your slippers on. We're going outside. Outside? Don't argue with me, George. Just do as you're told. I'm so sleepy that I can hardly see to walk, but my mother takes me firmly by the hand and leads me downstairs and out through the front door into the night, where the cold air is like a sponge of water in my face, and I open my eyes wide and see the lawn all sparkling with frost, and the cedar tree with its tremendous arms standing black against a thin, small moon, and overhead a great mass of stars is wheeling up into the sky. We hurry across the lawn. my mother and I, her bracelets all jingling like mad, and me having to trot to keep up with her. Each step I take, I can feel the crispy, frosty grass crunching softly underfoot. Josephine has just started having her babies, my mother says. It's a perfect opportunity. You shall watch the whole process. There is a light burning in the garage when we get there, and we go inside. My father isn't there, nor is the car, and the place seems huge and bare, and the concrete floor is freezing cold through the soles of my bedroom slippers. Josephine is reclining on a heap of straw inside the low wire cage in one corner of the room. A large blue rabbit with small pink eyes that watches suspiciously as we go toward her. The husband, whose name is Napoleon, is now in a separate cage in the opposite corner, and I notice that he is standing up on his hind legs, scratching impatiently at the netting. "Look," my mother cries. "She's just having the first one. It's almost out." We both creep closer to Josephine, and I squat down beside the cage with my face right up against the wire. I am fascinated. Here is one rabbit coming out of another. It is magical and rather splendid. It is also very quick. "Look how it comes out, all neatly wrapped up in its own little cellophane bag," my mother is saying. "And just look how she's taking care of it now. The poor darling doesn't have a face flannel, and even if she did, she couldn't hold on to it with her paws. So she's washing it with her tongue instead." The mother rabbit rolls her small pink eyes anxiously in our direction, and then I see her shifting position in the straw so that her body is between us and the young one. "Come round the other side," my mother says. The silly thing has moved. I do believe she's trying to hide her baby from us. We go round the other side of the cage. The rabbit follows us with her eyes. A couple of yards away, the buck is prancing madly up and down, clawing up the wire. "Why is Napoleon so excited?" I ask. "I don't know, dear. Don't bother about him. Watch Josephine. I expect she'll be having another one soon. Look how carefully she's washing that little baby. She's treating him just like a human mother treats hers. Isn't it funny to think that I did almost exactly the same sort of thing to you once?" The big blue doe is still watching us, and now, again, she pushes the baby away with her nose and rolls slowly over to face the other way. Then she goes on with her licking and cleaning. "Isn't it wonderful how a mother knows instinctively just what she has to do?" my mother says. "Now, you just imagine, my pet, that that baby is you and Josephine is me. Wait a minute. Come back over here so you can get a better look." We creep back again, round the cage, to keep the baby in view. "See how she's fondling it and kissing it all over. There, she's really kissing it now. Isn't she exactly like me and you?" I peer closer. It seems a queer way of kissing to me. "Look!" I scream. "She's eating it!" And sure enough, the head of the baby rabbit is now disappearing swiftly into the mother's mouth. "Mummy, quick!" But almost before the sound of my scream has died away, the whole of that tiny pink body has vanished down the mother's throat. I swing quickly round, and the next thing I know, I'm looking straight into my own mother's face, not 6 inches above me, and no doubt she is trying to say something, or it may be that she is too astonished to say anything. But all I see is the mouth, the huge red mouth, opening wider and wider, until it is just a great big round gaping hole with a black centre, and I scream again, and this time I can't stop. Then suddenly out come her hands, and I can feel her skin touching mine, the long, cold fingers close tightly over my fists, and I jump back and jerk myself free and rush blindly into the night. I run down the drive and through the front gates, screaming all the way, and then, above the noise of my own voice, I can hear the jingle of bracelets coming up behind me in the dark, getting louder and louder as she keeps gaining on me all the way down the long hill to the bottom of the lane and over the bridge onto the main road where the cars are streaming by at 60 miles an hour with headlights blazing. Then somewhere behind me I hear a screech of tires skidding on the road surface, and then there is silence, and I notice suddenly that the bracelets aren't jingling behind me any more. Poor mother. If only she could have lived a little longer. I admit that she gave me a nasty fright with those rabbits, but it wasn't her fault, and anyway, queer things like that were always happening between her and me. I had come to regard them as a sort of toughening process that did me more good than harm. But if only she could have lived long enough to complete my education, I'm sure I should never have had all that trouble I was telling you about. a few minutes ago. I want to get on with that now. I didn't mean to begin talking about my mother. She doesn't have anything to do with what I originally started out to say. I won't mention her again. I was telling you about the spinsters in my parish. It's an ugly word, isn't it, spinster? It conjures up the vision either of a stringy old hen with a puckered mouth, or of a huge ribald monster shouting around the house in riding breeches. But these were not like that at all. They were a clean, healthy, well-built group of females, the majority of them highly bred and surprisingly wealthy, and I feel sure that the average unmarried man would have been gratified to have them around. In the beginning, when I first came to the vicarage, I didn't have too bad a time. I enjoyed a measure of protection, of course, by reason of my calling and my cloth. In addition, I myself adopted a cool, dignified attitude that was calculated to discourage familiarity. For a few months, therefore, I was able to move freely among my parishioners, and no one took the liberty of linking her arm in mine at a charity bazaar, or of touching my fingers with hers as she passed me the curate at supper-time. I was very happy. I was feeling better than I had in years. Even that little nervous habit I have of flicking my earlobe with my forefinger when I talked began to disappear. This was what I call my first period. It extended over approximately 6 months. Then came trouble. I suppose I should have known that a healthy male like myself couldn't hope to evade embroilment indefinitely, simply by keeping a fair distance between himself and the ladies. It just doesn't work. If anything, it has the opposite effect. I would see them eyeing me covertly across the room at a whist drive, whispering to one another, nodding, running their tongues over their lips, sucking at their cigarettes, plotting the best approach, but always whispering, and sometimes I overheard snatches of their talk. What a shy person. He's just a trifle nervous, isn't he? He's much too tense. He needs companionship. He wants loosening up. We must teach him how to relax. And then slowly, as the weeks went by, they began to stalk me, and I knew they were doing it. I could feel it happening, although at first they did nothing definite to give themselves away. That was my second period. It lasted for the best part of a year, and was very trying indeed. But it was paradise compared with the third and final phase. For now, instead of sniping at me sporadically from far away, the attackers suddenly came charging out of the wood with bayonets fixed. It was terrible, frightening. Nothing is more calculated to unnerve a man than the swift, unexpected assault. Yet I am not a coward. I will stand my ground against any single individual of my own size under any circumstances. But this onslaught, I am now convinced, was conducted by vast numbers operating as one skillfully coordinated unit. The first offender was Miss Elphinstone, a large woman with moles. I had dropped in on her during the afternoon to solicit a contribution towards a new set of bellows for the organ, and after some pleasant conversation in the library, she had graciously handed me a cheque for 2 guineas. I told her not to bother to see me to the door, and I went out into the hall to get my hat. I was about to reach for it, when all at once, she must have come tiptoeing up behind me, all at once I felt a bare arm sliding through mine, and 1 second later her fingers were entwining in my own, and she was squeezing my hand hard, in, out, as though it were the bulb of a throat spray. "Are you really so very reverend as you're always pretending to be?" she whispered. Well, all I can tell you is that when that arm of hers came sliding under mine, it felt exactly as though a cobra was coiling itself around my wrist. I leapt away, pulled open the front door, and fled down the drive without looking back. The very next day we held a jumble sale in the village hall, again to raise money for the new bellows, and towards the end of it I was standing in a corner quietly drinking a cup of tea and keeping an eye on the villagers crowding round the stalls, when all of a sudden I heard a voice beside me saying, "Dear me, what a hungry look you have in those eyes of yours." The next instant a long, curvaceous body was leaning up against mine, and a hand with red fingernails was trying to push a thick slice of coconut cake into my mouth. "Miss Pratley," I cried, "please." But she got me up against the wall, and with a teacup in one hand and a saucer in the other, I was powerless to resist. I felt the sweat breaking out all over me, and if my mouth hadn't quickly become full of the cake she was pushing into it, I honestly believe I would have started to scream. A nasty incident, that one, but there was worse to come. The next day, it was Miss Unwin. Now, Miss Unwin happened to be a close friend of Miss Elphinstone's and of Miss Pratley's, and this, of course, should have been enough to make me very cautious. Yet who would have thought that she of all people, Miss Unwin, that quiet, gentle little mouse, who only a few weeks before had presented me with a new hassock exquisitely worked in needlepoint with her own hands, who would have thought that she would ever have taken a liberty with anyone? So, when she asked me to accompany her down to the crypt to show her the Saxon murals, it never entered my head that there was devilry afoot. But there was. I don't propose to describe that encounter, it was too painful, and the ones which followed were no less savage. Nearly every day, from then on, some new outrageous incident would take place. I became a nervous wreck. At times, I hardly knew what I was doing. I started reading the burial service at young Gladys Pitcher's wedding. I dropped Miss Harris's new baby into the font during the christening and gave it a nasty ducking. An uncomfortable rash that I hadn't had in over 2 years reappeared on the side of my neck, and that annoying business with my earlobe came back worse than ever before. Even my hair began coming out in my comb. The faster I retreated, the faster they came after me. Women are like that. Nothing stimulates them quite so much as a display of modesty or shyness in a man, and they became doubly persistent if underneath it all they happened to detect, and here I have a most difficult confession to make, if they happened to detect, as they did in me, a little secret gleam of longing shining in the backs of the eyes. You see, actually, I was mad about women. Yes, I know. You will find this hard to believe after all that I have said, but it was perfectly true. You must understand that it was only when they touched me with their fingers or pushed up against me with their bodies that I became alarmed. Providing they remained at a safe distance, I would watch them for hours on end with the same peculiar fascination that you yourself might experience in watching a creature you couldn't bear to touch, an octopus, for example, or a long poisonous snake. I loved the smooth, white look of a bare arm emerging from a sleeve, curiously naked, like a peeled banana. I could get enormously excited just from watching a girl walk across the room in a tight dress, and I particularly enjoyed the back view of the pair of legs when the feet were in rather high heels, the wonderful braced-up look behind the knees, with the legs themselves very taut, as though they were made of strong elastic, stretched out almost to breaking point, but not quite. Sometimes, in Lady Birdwell's drawing-room, sitting near the window on a summer's afternoon, I would glance over the rim of my teacup towards the swimming pool and become agitated beyond measure by the sight of a little patch of sunburned stomach bulging between the top and bottom of a two-piece bathing suit. There is nothing wrong in having thoughts like these. All men harbour them from time to time, but they did give me a terrible sense of guilt. Is it me, I kept asking myself, who is unwittingly responsible for the shameless way in which these ladies are now behaving? Is it the gleam in my eye, which I cannot control, that is constantly rousing their passions and egging them on? Am I unconsciously giving them what is sometimes known as the come hither signal every time I glance their way? Am I? Or is this brutal conduct of theirs inherent in the very nature of the female? I had a pretty fair idea of the answer to this question, but that was not good enough for me. I happen to possess a conscience that can never be consoled by guesswork. It has to have proof. I simply had to find out who was really the guilty party in this case, me or them, and with this object in view, I now decided to perform a simple experiment of my own invention, using Snelling's rats. A year or so previously, I had had some trouble with an objectionable choir boy named Billy Snelling. On 3 consecutive Sundays, this youth had brought a pair of white rats into church and had let them loose on the floor during my sermon. In the end, I had confiscated the animals and carried them home and placed them in a box in the shed at the bottom of the vicarage garden. Purely for humane reasons, I had then proceeded to feed them, and as a result, without any further encouragement from me, the creatures began to multiply very rapidly. The 2 became 5, and 5 became 12. It was at this point that I decided to use them for research purposes. There were exactly equal numbers of males and females, 6 of each, so that conditions were ideal. I first isolated the sexes, putting them into 2 separate cages, and I left them like that for 3 whole weeks. Now, a rat is a very lascivious animal, and any zoologist will tell you that for them this is an inordinately long period of separation. At a guess, I would say that 1 week of enforced celibacy for a rat is equal to approximately 1 year of the same treatment for someone like Miss Elphinston or Miss Pratley. So you can see that I was doing a pretty fair job in reproducing actual conditions. When the 3 weeks were up, I took a large box that was divided across the center by a little fence, and I placed the females on one side and the males on the other. The fence consisted of nothing more than 3 single strands of naked wire, 1 inch apart, but there was a powerful electric current running through the wires. To add a touch of reality to the proceedings, I gave each female a name. The largest one, who had also the longest whiskers, was Miss Elphinstone. The one with the short, thick tail was Miss Pratley. The smallest of them all was Miss Unwin, and so on. The males, all 6 of them, were me. I now pulled up a chair and sat back to watch the result. All rats are suspicious by nature, and when I first put the 2 sexes together in the box, with only the wire between them, neither side made a move. The males stared hard at the females through the fence. The females stared back, waiting for the males to come forward. I could see that both sides were tense with yearning. Whiskers quivered and noses twitched, and occasionally a long tail would flick sharply against the wall of the box. After a while, the first male detached himself from his group and advanced gingerly toward the fence, his belly close to the ground. He touched a wire and was immediately electrocuted. The remaining 11 rats froze, motionless. There followed a period of 9.5 minutes, during which neither side moved, and I noticed that while all the males were now staring at the dead body of their colleague, the females had only eyes for the males. Then suddenly, Miss Pratley, with the short tail, could stand it no longer. She came bounding forward, hit the wire, and dropped dead. The males pressed their bodies closer to the ground and gazed thoughtfully at the 2 corpses by the fence. The females also seemed to be quite shaken, and there was another wait, with neither side moving. Now it was Miss Unwin who began to show signs of impatience. She snorted audibly and twitched a pink mobile nose end from side to side. Then suddenly she started jerking her body quickly up and down as though she were doing push-ups. She glanced round at her remaining 4 companions, raised her tail high in the air as much as to say, "Here I go, girls," and with that she advanced briskly to the wire, pushed her head through it, and was killed. 16 minutes later, Miss Foster made her first move. Miss Foster was a woman in the village who bred cats, and recently she had had the effrontery to put up a large sign outside her house in the High Street saying, "Foster's Cattery." Through long association with the creatures, she herself seemed to have acquired all their most noxious characteristics, and whenever she came near me in a room, I could detect, even through the smoke of her Russian cigarette, a faint but pungent aroma of cat. She had never struck me as having much control over her baser instincts, and it was with some satisfaction, therefore, that I watched her now as she foolishly took her own life in a last desperate plunge towards the masculine sex. A Miss Montgomery Smith came next, a small, determined woman who had once tried to make me believe that she had been engaged to a bishop. She died trying to creep on her belly under the lowest wire, and I must say I thought this a fair reflection upon the way in which she lived her life. and still the 5 remaining males stayed motionless, waiting. The 5th female to go was Miss Plumley. She was a devious one who was continually slipping little messages addressed to me into the collection bag. Only the Sunday before, I had been in the vestry counting the money after morning service, and had come across one of them tucked inside a folded 10-shilling note. "Your poor throat sounded hoarse today during the sermon," it said. "Let me bring you a bottle of my own cherry pectoral to soothe it down. Most affectionately, Eunice Plumley." Miss Plumley ambled slowly up to the wire, sniffed the centre strand with the tip of her nose, came a fraction too close, and received 240 volts of alternating current through her body. The 5 males stayed where they were, watching the slaughter, and now only Miss Elphinstone remained on the feminine side. For a full half hour, neither she nor any of the others made a move. Finally, one of the males stirred himself slightly, took a step forward, hesitated, thought better of it, and slowly sank back into a crouch on the floor. This must have frustrated Miss Elphinstone beyond measure, for suddenly, with eyes blazing, she rushed forward and took a flying leap at the wire. It was a spectacular jump, and she nearly cleared it, but one of her hind legs grazed the top strand, and thus she also perished with the rest of her sex. I cannot tell you how much good it did me to watch this simple, and though I say it myself, this rather ingenious experiment. In one stroke, I had laid open the incredibly lascivious, stop-at-nothing nature of the female. My own sex was vindicated, my own conscience was cleared. In a trice, all those awkward little flashes of guilt from which I had continually been suffering flew out of the window. I felt suddenly very strong and serene in the knowledge of my own innocence. For a few moments, I toyed with the absurd idea of electrifying the black iron railings that ran round the vicarage garden, or perhaps just the gate would be enough. Then I would sit back comfortably in a chair in the library and watch through the window as the real Miss Elphinstone and Pratley and Unwin came forward one after the other and paid the final penalty for pestering an innocent male. Such foolish thoughts. What I must actually do now, I told myself, was to weave around me a sort of invisible electric fence constructed entirely out of my own personal moral fibre. Behind this I would sit in perfect safety while the enemy, one after another, flung themselves against the wire. I'd begin by cultivating a brusque manner. I would speak crisply to all women and refrain from smiling at them. I would no longer step back a pace when one of them advanced upon me. I would stand my ground and glare at her, and if she said something that I considered suggestive, I would make a sharp retort. It was in this mood that I set off the very next day to attend Lady Birdwell's tennis party. I was not a player myself, but her ladyship had graciously invited me to drop in and mingle with the guests when play was over at 6 o'clock. I believe she thought that it lent a certain tone to a gathering to have a clergyman present, and she was probably hoping to persuade me to repeat the performance I gave the last time I was there, when I sat at the piano for a full half hour and a quarter after supper and entertained the guests with a detailed description of the evolution of the madrigal through the centuries. I arrived at the gates on my cycle promptly at 6 o'clock and pedalled up the long drive toward the house. This was the first week of June, and the rhododendrons were massed in great banks of pink and purple all the way along on either side. I was feeling unusually blithe and dauntless. The previous day's experiment with rats had made it impossible now for anyone to take me by surprise. I knew exactly what to expect, and I was armed accordingly. All around me the little fence was up. "Ah, good evening, Vicar," Lady Birdwell cried, advancing upon me with both arms outstretched. I stood my ground and looked her straight in the eye. "How's Birdwell?" I said. "Still up in the city?" I doubt whether she had ever before in her life heard Lord Birdwell referred to thus by someone who had never even met him. It stopped her dead in her tracks. She looked at me queerly, and didn't seem to know how to answer. "I'll take a seat if I may," I said, and walked past her towards the terrace, where a group of 9 or 10 guests were settled comfortably in cane chairs, sipping their drinks. They were mostly women, the usual crowd, all of them dressed in white tennis clothes, and as I strode in among them, my own sober black suiting seemed to give me, I thought, just the right amount of separateness for the occasion. The ladies greeted me with smiles. I nodded to them and sat down in a vacant chair, but I didn't smile back. "I think perhaps I'd better finish my story another time," Mr. Elphinstone was saying. "I don't believe the vicar would approve." She giggled and gave me an arch look. I knew she was waiting for me to come out with my usual little nervous laugh and to say my usual little sentence about how broad-minded I was, but I did nothing of the sort. I simply raised one side of my upper lip until it shaped itself into a tiny curl of contempt. I had practiced in the mirror that morning, and then I said sharply in a loud voice, "Mens sana in corpore sano." "What's that?" she cried. "Come again, vicar." "A clean mind in a healthy body," I answered. "It's a family motto." There was an odd kind of silence for quite a long time after this. I could see the women exchanging glances with one another, frowning, shaking their heads. "The vicar's in the dumps," Miss Forster announced. She was the one who bred cats. "I think the vicar needs a drink." "Thank you," I said, "but I never imbibe. You know that." "Then do let me fetch you a nice cooling glass of fruit cup." This last sentence came softly and rather suddenly from someone just behind me, to my right, and there was a note of such genuine concern in the speaker's voice that I turned round. I saw a lady of singular beauty, whom I had met only once before, about a month ago. Her name was Miss Roach, and I remembered that she had struck me then as being a person far out of the usual run. I had been particularly impressed by her gentle and reticent nature, and the fact that I had always felt comfortable in her presence proved beyond doubt that she was not the sort of person who would try to impinge herself upon me in any way. "I'm sure you must be tired after cycling all that distance," she was saying now. I swiveled right round in my chair and looked at her carefully. She was certainly a striking person, unusually muscular for a woman, with broad shoulders and powerful arms, and a huge calf bulging on each leg. The flush of the afternoon's exertions was still upon her, and her face glowed with a healthy red sheen. "Thank you so much, Miss Roach," I said, "but I never touch alcohol in any form. Maybe a small glass of lemon squash." "The fruit cup is only made of fruit, Padre." How I loved a person who called me Padre. The word has a military ring about it that conjures up visions of stern discipline and officer rank. "Fruit cup?" Miss Elphinstone said. "It's harmless." "My dear man, it's nothing but vitamin C," Miss Forster said. "Much better for you than fizzy lemonade," Lady Birdwell said. "Carbon dioxide attacks the lining of the stomach." "I'll get you some," Miss Roach said, smiling at me pleasantly. It was a good, open smile, and there wasn't a trace of guile or mischief from one corner of the mouth to the other. She stood up and walked over to the drink table. I saw her slicing an orange, then an apple, then a cucumber, then a grape, and dropping the slices into a glass. Then she poured in a large quantity of liquid from a bottle whose label I couldn't quite read without my spectacles, but I fancied that I saw the name Jim, or Tim, or Pim, or some such word. "I hope there's enough left," Lady Birdwell called out. "Those greedy children of mine do love it so." "Plenty," Miss Roach answered, and she brought the drink to me and set it on the table. Even without tasting it, I could easily understand why children adored it. The liquid itself was dark amber red, and there were great hunks of fruit floating around amongst the ice cubes, and on top of it all Miss Roach had placed a sprig of mint. I guessed that the mint had been put there especially for me, to take some of the sweetness away and to lend a touch of grown-upness to a concoction that was otherwise so obviously for youngsters. "Too sticky for you, Padre?" "It's delectable," I said, sipping it. "Quite perfect." It seemed a pity to gulp it down quickly after all the trouble Miss Roach had taken to make it, but it was so refreshing I couldn't resist. "Do let me make you another." I liked the way she waited until I had set the glass on the table instead of trying to take it out of my hand. "I wouldn't eat the mint if I were you," Miss Elphinston said. "I'd better get another bottle from the house," Lady Birdwell called out. "You're going to need it, Mildred." "Do that," Miss Roach replied. "I drink gallons of the stuff myself," she went on, speaking to me, "and I don't think you'd say that I'm particularly what you might call emaciated." "No, indeed," I answered fervently. I was watching her again as she mixed me another brew, noticing how the muscles rippled under the skin of the arm that raised the bottle. Her neck was also uncommonly fine, when seen from behind, not thin and stringy, like the necks of a lot of these so-called modern beauties, but thick and strong, with a slight ridge running down either side where the sinews bulged. It wasn't easy to guess the age of a person like this, but I doubted whether she could have been more than 48 or 9. I had just finished my second big glass of fruit cup when I began to experience a most peculiar sensation. I seemed to be floating up out of my chair, and hundreds of little warm waves came washing in under me, lifting me higher and higher. I felt as buoyant as a bubble, and everything around me seemed to be bobbing up and down and swirling gently from side to side. It was all very pleasant, and I was overcome by an almost irresistible desire to break into song. "Feeling happy?" Miss Roach's voice sounded miles and miles away, and when I turned to look at her, I was astonished to see how near she really was. She also was bobbing up and down. "Terrific," I answered. "I'm feeling absolutely terrific." Her face was large and pink, and it was so close to me now that I could see the pale carpet of fuzz covering both her cheeks, and the way the sunlight caught each tiny separate hair and made it shine like gold. All of a sudden, I found myself wanting to put out a hand and stroke those cheeks of hers with my fingers. To tell the truth, I wouldn't have objected in the least if she had tried to do the same to me. "Listen," she said softly, "how about the two of us taking a little stroll down the garden to see the lupins?" "Fine," I answered. "Lovely, anything you say." There is a small Georgian summer-house alongside the croquet lawn in Lady Birdwell's garden, and the very next thing I knew, I was sitting inside it on a kind of chaise longue, and Miss Roach was beside me. I was still bobbing up and down, and so was she, and so, for that matter, was the summer-house, but I was feeling wonderful. I asked Miss Roach if she would like me to give her a song. "Not now," she said, encircling me with her arms and squeezing my chest against hers so hard that it hurt. "Don't," I said, melting. "That's better," she kept saying. "That's much better, isn't it?" Had Miss Roach or any other female tried to do this sort of thing to me an hour before, I don't quite know what would have happened. I think I would probably have fainted. I might even have died. But here I was now, the same old me, actually relishing the contact of those enormous bare arms against my body. Also, and this was the most amazing thing of all, I was beginning to feel the urge to reciprocate. I took the lobe of her left ear between my thumb and forefinger and tugged it playfully. "Naughty boy," she said. I tugged harder and squeezed it a bit at the same time. This roused her to such a pitch that she began to grunt and snort like a hog. Her breathing became loud and stertorous. "Kiss me," she ordered. "What?" I said. "Come on, kiss me." At that moment, I saw her mouth. I saw this great mouth of hers coming slowly down on top of me, starting to open and coming closer and closer and opening wider and wider, and suddenly my whole stomach began to roll right over inside me, and I went stiff with terror. "No," I shrieked. Don't, Mummy, don't." I can only tell you that I had never in all my life seen anything more terrifying than that mouth. I simply could not stand it coming at me like that. Had it been a red-hot iron someone was pushing into my face, I wouldn't have been nearly so petrified. I swear I wouldn't. The strong arms were around me, pinning me down so that I couldn't move, and the mouth kept getting larger and larger, and then all at once it was right on top of me, huge and wet and cavernous, and the next second I was inside it. I was right inside this enormous mouth, lying on my stomach along the length of the tongue, and my feet somewhere around the back of the throat. And I knew instinctively that unless I got myself out again at once, I was going to be swallowed alive, just like that baby rabbit. I could feel my legs being drawn down the throat by some kind of suction, and quickly I threw my arms and grabbed hold of the lower front teeth and held on for dear life. My head was near the mouth entrance, and I could actually look right out between the lips and see a little patch of the world outside, sunlight shining on the polished wooden floor of the summer house, and on the floor itself a gigantic foot in a white tennis shoe. I had a good grip with my fingers on the edge of the teeth, and in spite of the suction, I was managing to haul myself up slowly towards the daylight, when suddenly the upper teeth came down on my knuckles and started chopping away at them so fiercely I had to let go. I went sliding back down the throat, feet first, clutching madly at this and that as I went, but everything was so smooth and slippery I couldn't get a grip. I glimpsed a bright flash of gold on the left as I slid past the last of the molars, and then, 3 inches farther on, I saw what must have been the uvula above me, dangling like a thick red stalactite from the roof of the throat. I grabbed at it with both hands, but the thing slithered through my fingers, and I went on down. I remember screaming for help, but I could barely hear the sound of my own voice above the noise of the wind that was caused by the throat owner's breathing. There seemed to be a gale blowing all the time, a queer, erratic gale that blew alternately very cold as the air came in and very hot as it went out again. I managed to get my elbows hooked over a sharp, fleshy ridge, I presume the epiglottis, and for a moment I hung there, defying the suction and scrabbling with my feet to find a foothold on the wall of the larynx. But the throat gave a huge swallow that jerked me away, and down I went again. From then on, there was nothing else for me to catch hold of, and down I went, until soon my legs were dangling below me in the upper reaches of the stomach, and I could feel the slow, powerful pulsing of peristalsis dragging away at my ankles, pulling me down and down and down. Far above me, outside in the open air, I could hear the distant babble of women's voices. "It's not true! But my dear Mildred, how awful! The man must be mad! Your poor mouth! Just look at it! A sex maniac, a sadist! Someone ought to write to the bishop!" And then Miss Roach's voice, louder than the others, swearing and screeching like a parakeet. "He's damn lucky I didn't kill him, the little bastard," I said to him. "Listen," I said, "if ever I happen to want any of my teeth extracted, I'll go to a dentist, not to a goddamn vicar." It isn't as though I'd given him any encouragement either. Where is he now, Mildred? God knows, in the bloody summer house, I suppose. Hey, girls, let's go and root him out. Oh dear. Looking back on it all now, some 3 weeks later, I don't know how I ever came through the nightmare of that awful afternoon without taking leave of my senses. A gang of witches like that is a very dangerous thing to fool around with, and had they managed to catch me in the summer house right then and there, when their blood was up, they would as likely as not have torn me limb from limb on the spot. Either that, or I should have been frog-marched down to the police station with Lady Birdwell and Miss Roach leading the procession through the main street of the village. But, of course, they didn't catch me. They didn't catch me then, and they haven't caught me yet, and if my luck continues to hold, I think I've got a fair chance of evading them altogether, or anyway for a few months, until they forget about the whole affair. As you might guess, I am having to keep entirely to myself and to take no part in public affairs or social life. I find that writing is a most salutary occupation at a time like this, and I spend many hours each day playing with sentences. I regard each sentence as a little wheel, and my ambition lately has been to gather several hundred of them together at once and to fit them all, end to end, with the cogs interlocking like gears, but each wheel a different size, each turning at a different speed. Now and again I try to put a really big one right next to a very small one in such a way that the big one, turning slowly, will make the small one spin so fast that it hums. Very tricky, that. I also sing madrigals in the evenings, but I miss my own harpsichord terribly. All the same, this isn't such a bad place, and I have made myself as comfortable as I possibly can. It is a small chamber, situated in what is almost certainly the primary section of the duodenal loop, just before it begins to run vertically downward in front of the right kidney. The floor is quite level. Indeed, it was the first level place I came to during that horrible descent down Miss Roach's throat, and that's the reason I managed to stop at all. Above me I can see a pulpy sort of opening that I take to be the pylorus, where the stomach enters the small intestine. I can still remember some of those diagrams my mother used to show me, and below me there is a funny little hole in the wall where the pancreatic duct enters the lower section of the duodenum. It is all a trifle bizarre for a man of conservative tastes like myself. Personally, I prefer oak furniture and parquet flooring. But there is anyway one thing here that pleases me greatly, and that is the walls. They are lovely and soft, like a sort of padding, and the advantage of this is that I can bounce up against them as much as I wish without hurting myself. There are several other people about, which is rather surprising, but thank God they are every one of them males. For some reason or other, they all wear white coats and they bustle around, pretending to be very busy and important. In actual fact, they are an uncommonly ignorant bunch of fellows. They don't even seem to realize where they are. I try to tell them, but they refuse to listen. Sometimes I get so angry and frustrated with them that I lose my temper and start to shout, and then a sly, mistrustful look comes over their faces, and they begin backing slowly away and saying, "Now then, take it easy, Vicar, there's a good boy, take it easy." What sort of talk is that? But there is one oldish man, he comes in to see me every morning after breakfast, who appears to live slightly closer to reality than the others. He is civil and dignified, and I imagine he is lonely, because he likes nothing better than to sit quietly in my room and listen to me talk. The only trouble is that whenever we get on to the subject of our whereabouts, he starts telling me that he's going to help me escape. He said it again this morning, and we had quite an argument about it. "But can't you see," I said patiently, "I don't want to escape. My dear Vicar, why ever not? I keep telling you because they're all searching for me outside." "Who?" "Miss Elphinstone, and Miss Roach, and Miss Brackley, and all the rest of them." "What nonsense." "Oh, yes, they are, and I imagine they're after you as well, but you won't admit it." "No, my friend, they are not after me." "Then may I ask precisely what you are doing down here?" A bit of a stumper for him, that one. I could see he didn't know how to answer it. "I'll bet you were fooling around with Miss Roach and got yourself swallowed up just the same as I did. I'll bet that's exactly what happened, only you're too ashamed to admit it." He looked suddenly so wan and defeated when I said this that I felt sorry for him. "Would you like me to sing you a song?" I asked. But he got up, without answering, and went quietly out into the corridor. "Cheer up," I called after him. "Don't be depressed. There is always some balm in Gilead."
The Way Up to Heaven. All her life, Mrs. Foster had had an almost pathological fear of missing a train, a plane, a boat, or even a theatre curtain. In other respects, she was not a particularly nervous woman, but the mere thought of being late on occasions like these would throw her into such a state of nerves that she would begin to twitch. It was nothing much, just a tiny velicating muscle in the corner of the left eye, like a secret wink, but the annoying thing was that it refused to disappear until an hour or so after the train or plane or whatever it was had been safely caught. It was really extraordinary how in certain people a simple apprehension about a thing like catching a train can grow into a serious obsession. At least half an hour before it was time to leave the house for the station, Mrs. Foster would step out of the elevator, all ready to go, with hat and coat and gloves, and then, being quite unable to sit down, she would flutter and fidget about from room to room until her husband, who must have been well aware of her state, finally emerged from his privacy and suggested in a cool, dry voice that perhaps they had better get going now, had they not? Mr. Foster may possibly have had a right to be irritated by this foolishness of his wife's, but he could have had no excuse for increasing her misery by keeping her waiting unnecessarily. Mind you, it is by no means certain that this is what he did, yet whenever they were to go somewhere, his timing was so accurate, just a minute or two late, you understand, and his manner so bland, that it was hard to believe he wasn't purposely inflicting a nasty, private little torture of his own on the unhappy lady. And one thing he must have known, that she would never dare to call out and tell him to hurry. He had disciplined her too well for that. He must also have known that if he was prepared to wait even beyond the last moment of safety, he could drive her nearly into hysterics. On one or two special occasions in the later years of their married life, it seemed almost as though he had wanted to miss the train, simply in order to intensify the poor woman's suffering. Assuming, though one cannot be sure, that the husband was guilty, what made his attitude doubly unreasonable was the fact that, with the exception of this one small, irrepressible foible, Mrs. Foster was and always had been a good and loving wife. For over 30 years she had served him loyally and well. There was no doubt about this. Even she, a very modest woman, was aware of it, and although she had for years refused to let herself believe that Mr. Foster would ever consciously torment her, there had been times recently when she had caught herself beginning to wonder. Mr. Eugene Foster, who was nearly 70 years old, lived with his wife in a large 6-story house in New York City on East 62nd Street, and they had 4 servants. It was a gloomy place, and few people came to visit them. But on this particular morning in January, the house had come alive, and there was a great deal of bustling about. One maid was distributing bundles of dust sheets to every room, while another was draping them over the furniture. The butler was bringing down suitcases and putting them in the hall. The cook kept popping up from the kitchen to have a word with the butler, and Mrs. Foster herself, in an old-fashioned fur coat and with a black hat on the top of her head, was flying from room to room and pretending to supervise these operations. Actually, she was thinking of nothing at all, except that she was going to miss her plane if her husband didn't come out of his study soon and get ready. "What time is it, Walker?" she said to the butler as she passed him. "It's 10 minutes past 9, madam." "And has the car come?" "Yes, madam, it's waiting. I'm just going to put the luggage in now." "It takes an hour to get to Kennedy," she said. "My plane leaves at 11, and I have to be there half an hour beforehand for the formalities. I shall be late. I just know I'm going to be late." "I think you have plenty of time, madam," the butler said kindly. "I warned Mr. Foster that you must leave at 9:15. There's still another 5 minutes." "Yes, Walker, I know. But get the luggage in quickly, will you, please?" She began walking up and down the hall, and whenever the butler came by, she asked him the time. This, she kept telling herself, was the one plane she must not miss. It had taken months to persuade her husband to allow her to go. If she missed it, he might easily decide that she should cancel the whole thing, and the trouble was that he insisted on coming to the airport to see her off. "Dear God," she said aloud, "I'm going to miss it. I know I'm going to miss it." The little muscle beside the left eye was twitching madly now. The eyes themselves were very close to tears. "What time is it, Walker?" "It's 18 minutes past, madam." "Now I really will miss it," she cried. "Oh, I wish he would come." This was an important journey for Mrs. Foster. She was going all alone to Paris to visit her daughter, her only child, who was married to a Frenchman. Mrs. Foster didn't care much for the Frenchman, but she was fond of her daughter, and more than that, she had developed a great yearning to set eyes on her 3 grandchildren. She knew them only from the many photographs that she had received, and that she kept putting up all over the house. They were beautiful, these children. She doted on them, and each time a new picture arrived she would carry it away and sit with it for a long time, staring at it lovingly, and searching the small faces for signs of that old, satisfying blood-likeness that meant so much. And now lately she had come more and more to feel that she did not really wish to live out her days in a place where she could not be near these children, and have them visit her, and take them for walks, and buy them presents, and watch them grow up. She knew, of course, that it was wrong, and in a way disloyal to have thoughts like these while her husband was still alive. She knew also that although he was no longer active in his many enterprises, he would never consent to leave New York and live in Paris. It was a miracle that he had ever agreed to let her fly over there alone for 6 weeks to visit them. But oh, how she wished she could live there always and be close to them. "Walker, what time is it?" 22 minutes past, madam." As he spoke, a door opened, and Mr. Foster came into the hall. He stood for a moment, looking intently at his wife, and she looked back at him, at this diminutive but still quite dapper old man with a huge bearded face that bore such an astonishing resemblance to those old photographs of Andrew Carnegie. "Well," he said, "I suppose we'd better get going fairly soon if you want to catch that plane." "Yes, dear, yes. Everything's ready. The car's waiting." "That's good," he said, with his head over to one side. He was watching her closely. He had a peculiar way of cocking the head and then moving it in a series of small, rapid jerks. Because of this, and because he was clasping his hands up high in front of him, near the chest, he was somehow like a squirrel standing there, a quick, clever old squirrel from the park. "Here's Walker with your coat, dear. Put it on." "I'll be with you in a moment," he said. "I'm just going to wash my hands." She waited for him, and the tall butler stood beside her, holding the coat and the hat. "Walker, will I miss it?" "No, madam," the butler said. "I think you'll make it all right." Then Mr. Foster appeared again, and the butler helped him on with his coat. Mrs. Foster hurried outside and got into the hired Cadillac. Her husband came after her, but he walked down the steps of the house slowly, pausing halfway to observe the sky and to sniff the cold morning air. "It looks a bit foggy," he said as he sat down beside her in the car, "and it's always worse out there at the airport. I shouldn't be surprised if the flight's cancelled already." "Don't say that, dear, please." They didn't speak again until the car had crossed over the river to Long Island. "I arranged everything with the servants," Mr. Foster said. "They're all going off today. I gave them half pay for 6 weeks and told Walker I'd send him a telegram when we wanted them back." "Yes," she said. "He told me." "I'll move into the club tonight. It'll be a nice change, staying at the club." "Yes, dear." "I'll write to you." "I'll call in at the house occasionally to see that everything's all right and to pick up the mail." "But don't you really think Walker should stay there all the time to look after things?" she asked meekly. "Nonsense. It's quite unnecessary anyway. I'd have to pay him full wages." "Oh," she said, "of course." "What's more, you never know what people get up to when they're left alone in a house," Mr. Foster announced. And with that, he took out a cigar, and after snipping off the end with a silver cutter, lit it with a gold lighter. She sat still in the car with her hands clasped together tight under the rug. "Will you write to me?" she asked. "I'll see," he said, "but I doubt it. You know I don't hold with letter writing unless there's something specific to say." "Yes, dear, I know, so don't you bother." They drove on along Queens Boulevard, and as they approached the flat marshland on which Kennedy is built, the fog began to thicken, and the car had to slow down. "Oh, dear," cried Mrs. Foster, "I'm sure I'm going to miss it now. What time is it?" "Stop fussing," the old man said. "It doesn't matter anyway. It's bound to be cancelled now. They never fly in this sort of weather. I don't know why you bother to come out." She couldn't be sure, but it seemed to her that there was suddenly a new note in his voice, and she turned to look at him. It was difficult to observe any change in his expression under all that hair. The mouth was what counted. She wished, as she had so often before, that she could see the mouth clearly. The eyes never showed anything except when he was in a rage. "Of course," he went on, "if by any chance it does go, then I agree with you, you'll be certain to miss it now. Why don't you resign yourself to that?" She turned away and peered through the window at the fog. It seemed to be getting thicker as they went along, and now she could only just make out the edge of the road and the margin of grassland beyond it. She knew that her husband was still looking at her. She glanced at him again, and this time she noticed with a kind of horror that he was staring intently at the little place in the corner of her left eye, where she could feel the muscle twitching. "Won't you?" he said.
"Won't I what?"
"Be sure to miss it now if it goes. We can't drive fast in this muck." He didn't speak to her any more after that. The car crawled on and on. The driver had a yellow lamp directed onto the edge of the road, and this helped him to keep going. Other lights, some white and some yellow, kept coming out of the fog toward them, and there was an especially bright one that followed close behind them all the time. Suddenly the driver stopped the car. "There," Mr. Foster cried. "We're stuck. I knew it." "No, sir," the driver said, turning round. "We made it. This is the airport." Without a word, Mrs. Foster jumped out and hurried through the main entrance into the building. There was a mass of people inside, mostly disconsolate passengers standing around the ticket counters. She pushed her way through and spoke to the clerk. "Yes," he said, "your flight is temporarily postponed. But please don't go away. We're expecting this weather to clear at any moment." She went back to her husband, who was still sitting in the car, and told him the news. "But don't you wait, dear," she said. "There's no sense in that." "I won't," he answered, "so long as the driver can get me back. Can you get me back, driver?" "I think so," the man said. "Is the luggage out?" "Yes, sir." "Goodbye, dear," Mrs. Foster said, leaning into the car and giving her husband a small kiss on the coarse grey fur of his cheek. "Goodbye," he answered. "Have a good trip." The car drove off, and Mrs. Foster was left alone. The rest of the day was a sort of nightmare for her. She sat for hour after hour on a bench as close to the airline counter as possible, and every 30 minutes or so she would get up and ask the clerk if the situation had changed. She always received the same reply, that she must continue to wait because the fog might blow away at any moment. It wasn't until after 6 in the evening that the loudspeakers finally announced that the flight had been postponed until 11 o'clock the next morning. Mrs. Foster didn't quite know what to do when she heard this news. She stayed sitting on her bench for at least another half-hour, wondering in a tired, hazy sort of way where she might go to spend the night. She hated to leave the airport. She didn't wish to see her husband. She was terrified that in one way or another he would eventually manage to prevent her from getting to France. She would have liked to remain just where she was, sitting on the bench the whole night through. That would be the safest. But she was already exhausted, and it didn't take her long to realize that this was a ridiculous thing for an elderly lady to do. So in the end she went to a phone and called the house. Her husband, who was on the point of leaving for the club, answered it himself. She told him the news and asked whether the servants were still there. "They've all gone," he said. "In that case, dear, I'll just get myself a room somewhere for the night, and don't you bother yourself about it at all." "That would be foolish," he said. "You've got a large house here at your disposal. Use it." "But, dear, it's empty." "Then I'll stay with you myself." "There's no food in the house. There's nothing." "Then eat before you come in. Don't be so stupid, woman. Everything you do, you seem to want to make a fuss about it." "Yes," she said, "I'm sorry. I'll get myself a sandwich here, and then I'll come on in." Outside, the fog had cleared a little, but it was still a long, slow drive in the taxi, and she didn't arrive back at the house on 62nd Street until fairly late. Her husband emerged from his study when he heard her coming in. "Well," he said, standing by the study door, "how was Paris?" "We'll leave at 11 in the morning," she answered. It's definite." "You mean if the fog clears?" "It's clearing now. There's a wind coming up." "You look tired," he said. "You must have had an anxious day." "It wasn't very comfortable. I think I'll go straight to bed." "I've ordered a car for the morning," he said. 9 o'clock. "Oh, thank you, dear. And I certainly hope you're not going to bother to come all the way out again to see me off." "No," he said slowly. "I don't think I will. But there's no reason why you shouldn't drop me at the club on your way." She looked at him. And at that moment, he seemed to be standing a long way off from her, beyond some borderline. He was suddenly so small and far away that she couldn't be sure what he was doing, or what he was thinking, or even what he was. "The club is downtown," she said. "It isn't on the way to the airport." "But you'll have plenty of time, my dear. Don't you want to drop me off at the club?" "Oh, yes, of course." "That's good. Then I'll see you in the morning, at 9. She went up to her bedroom on the 2nd floor, and she was so exhausted from her day that she fell asleep soon after she lay down. Next morning, Mrs. Foster was up early, and by 8:30 she was downstairs and ready to leave. Shortly after 9, her husband appeared. "Did you make any coffee?" he asked. "No, dear. I thought you'd get a nice breakfast at the club. The car is here. It's been waiting. I'm all ready to go." They were standing in the hall. They always seemed to be meeting in the hall nowadays, she with her hat and coat and purse, he in a curiously cut Edwardian jacket with high lapels. "Your luggage?" "It's at the airport." "Ah, yeah," he said. "Of course. And if you're going to take me to the club first, I suppose we'd better get going fairly soon, hadn't we?" "Yes," she cried. "Oh, yes, please." "I'm just going to get a few cigars. I'll be right with you. You get into the car." She turned and went out to where the chauffeur was standing, and he opened the car door for her as she approached. "What time is it?" she asked him. "About 9:15. Mr. Foster came out 5 minutes later, and watching him as he walked slowly down the steps, she noticed that his legs were like goats' legs in those narrow stovepipe trousers that he wore. As on the day before, he paused halfway down to sniff the air and to examine the sky. The weather was still not quite clear, but there was a wisp of sun coming through the mist. "Perhaps you'll be lucky this time," he said as he settled himself beside her in the car. "Hurry, please," she said to the chauffeur. "Don't bother about the rug. I'll arrange the rug. Please get going. I'm late." The man went back to his seat behind the wheel and started the engine. "Just a moment," Mr. Foster said suddenly. "Hold it a moment, chauffeur, will you?" "What is it, dear?" She saw him searching the pockets of his overcoat. "I had a little present I wanted you to take to Ellen," he said. "Now, where on earth is it? I'm sure I had it in my hand as I came down. I never saw you carrying anything. What sort of present?" "A little box wrapped up in white paper. I forgot to give it to you yesterday. I don't want to forget it today." "A little box?" Mrs. Foster cried. "I never saw any little box." She began hunting frantically in the back of the car. Her husband continued searching through the pockets of his coat. Then he unbuttoned the coat and felt around in his jacket. "Confound it," he said. "I must have left it in my bedroom. I won't be a moment." "Oh, please," she cried. "We haven't got time. Please, leave it. You can mail it. It's only one of those silly combs anyway. You're always giving her combs." "And what's wrong with combs, may I ask?" he said, furious that she should have forgotten herself for once. "Nothing, dear, I'm sure, but—" "Stay here," he commanded. "I'm going to get it." "Be quick, dear. Oh, please, be quick." She sat still, waiting and waiting. "Chauffeur, what time is it?" The man had a wristwatch which he consulted. "I make it nearly 9:30. "Can we get to the airport in an hour?" "Just about." At this point, Mrs. Foster suddenly spotted a corner of something white wedged down in the crack of the seat on the side where her husband had been sitting. She reached over and pulled out a small paper-wrapped box, and at the same time she couldn't help noticing that it was wedged down firm and deep, as though with the help of a pushing hand. "Here it is," she cried. "I found it. Oh, dear. And now he'll be up there forever searching for it. Chauffeur, quickly, run in and call him down, will you, please?" The chauffeur, a man with a small, rebellious Irish mouth, didn't very much care for any of this, but he climbed out of the car and went up the steps to the front door of the house. Then he turned and came back. "Door's locked," he announced. "You got a key?"
"Yes, wait a moment."
She began hunting madly in her purse. The little face was screwed up tight with anxiety, the lips pushed outward like a spout.
"Here it is. No, I'll go myself. It'll be quicker. I know where he'll be."
She hurried out of the car and up the steps to the front door, holding the key in one hand. She slid the key into the keyhole and was about to turn it, and then she stopped. Her head came up, and she stood there, absolutely motionless, her whole body arrested right in the middle of all this hurry to turn the key and get into the house. And she waited. 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 seconds. She waited. The way she was standing there, with her head in the air and the body so tense, it seemed as though she were listening for the repetition of some sound that she had heard a moment before from a place far away inside the house. Yes, quite obviously she was listening. Her whole attitude was a listening one. She appeared actually to be moving one of her ears closer and closer to the door. Now it was right up against the door, and for still another few seconds she remained in that position, head up, ear to door, hand on key, about to enter but not entering, trying instead, or so it seemed, to hear and to analyze these sounds that were coming faintly from this place deep within the house. Then, all at once, she sprang to life again. She withdrew the key from the door and came running back down the steps. "It's too late," she cried to the chauffeur. "I can't wait for him. I simply can't. I'll miss the plane. Hurry now, driver. Hurry to the airport." The chauffeur, had he been watching her closely, might have noticed that her face had turned absolutely white, and that the whole expression had suddenly altered. There was no longer that rather soft and silly look. A peculiar hardness had settled itself upon the features. The little mouth, usually so flabby, was now tight and thin. The eyes were bright, and the voice, when she spoke, carried a new note of authority. "Hurry, driver, hurry!" "Isn't your husband traveling with you?" the man asked, astonished. "Certainly not. I was only going to drop him at the club. It won't matter. He'll understand. He'll get a cab. Don't sit there talking, man. Get going. I've got a plane to catch for Paris." With Mrs. Foster urging him from the back seat, the man drove fast all the way, and she caught her plane with a few minutes to spare. Soon she was high up over the Atlantic, reclining comfortably in her aeroplane chair, listening to the hum of the motors, heading for Paris at last. The new mood was still with her. She felt remarkably strong, and, in a queer sort of way, wonderful. She was a trifle breathless with it all, but this was more from pure astonishment at what she had done than anything else. And, as the plane flew farther and farther away from New York and East 62nd Street, a great sense of calmness began to settle upon her. By the time she reached Paris, she was just as strong and cool and calm as she could wish. She met her grandchildren, and they were even more beautiful in the flesh than in their photographs. They were like angels, she told herself. So beautiful they were. And every day she took them for walks and fed them cakes and bought them presents and told them charming stories. Once a week, on Tuesdays, she wrote a letter to her husband, a nice, chatty letter full of news and gossip, which always ended with the words, "Now be sure to take your meals regularly, dear, although this is something I'm afraid you may not be doing when I'm not with you." When the 6 weeks were up, everybody was sad that she had to return to America, to her husband. Everybody, that is, except her. Surprisingly, she didn't seem to mind as much as one might have expected, and when she kissed them all good-bye, there was something in her manner and in the things she said that appeared to hint at the possibility of a return in the not-too-distant future. However, like the faithful wife she was, she did not overstay her time. Exactly 6 weeks after she had arrived, she sent a cable to her husband and caught the plane back to New York. Arriving at Kennedy, Mrs. Foster was interested to observe that there was no car to meet her.
It is possible that she might even have been a little amused. But she was extremely calm, and did not overtip the porter, who helped her into a taxi with her baggage. New York was colder than Paris, and there were lumps of dirty snow lying in the gutters of the streets. The taxi drew up before the house on 62nd Street, and Mrs. Foster persuaded the driver to carry her 2 large cases to the top of the steps. Then she paid him off and rang the bell. She waited, but there was no answer. Just to make sure, she rang again, and she could hear it tinkling shrilly far away in the pantry at the back of the house. But still, no one came. So she took out her key and opened the door herself. The first thing she saw as she entered was a great pile of mail lying on the floor, where it had fallen after being slipped through the letterbox. The place was dark and cold. A dust sheet was still draped over the grandfather clock. In spite of the cold, the atmosphere was peculiarly oppressive, and there was a faint and curious odour in the air that she had never smelled before. She walked quickly across the hall and disappeared for a moment around the corner to the left, at the back. There was something deliberate and purposeful about this action. She had the air of a woman who is off to investigate a rumour or to confirm a suspicion, and when she returned a few seconds later, there was a little glimmer of satisfaction on her face. She paused in the centre of the hall, as though wondering what to do next. Then suddenly she turned and went across into her husband's study. On the desk she found his address book, and after hunting through it for a while, she picked up the phone and dialed a number. "Hello," she said. "Listen, this is 9 East 62nd Street. Yes, that's right. Could you send someone round as soon as possible, do you think? Yes, it seems to be stuck between the 2nd and 3rd floors. At least, that's where the indicator's pointing. Right away? Oh, that's very kind of you. You see, my legs aren't too good for walking up a lot of stairs. Thank you so much. Goodbye." She replaced the receiver and sat there at her husband's desk, patiently waiting for the man who would be coming soon to repair the lift.